to Humanities in Session. Today's session is a seminar by CHR visiting scholar Muhannad Ayyash. Muhannad is visiting the CHR on his sabbatical from mid-February to mid-April, so we've had the special privilege of being able to interact with Muhannad and engage with his work while he's been in residence, but we haven't yet engaged with his scholarship. I should add that Muhannad has been an unbelievably active interlocutor, given that it's given the unfolding genocide, and that's a question, a term I'd like to park and return to in our conversation. But given the unfolding genocide, Muhannad has very graciously and generously been giving radio interviews, doing public talks, a number of public talks, panel discussions, and I understand also talk in a mosque to 4,000 tomorrow, yeah. 4,000 people in person and 5,000 online, which I understand is the biggest audience you've addressed knowingly, yeah. Although you have a big presence on Canadian public in Canadian media in the last while, so we don't know how many people you're addressing through those forums, but I just want to mark the incredible kind of generosity and commitment of Muhannad during this time and during the time of his residency. So Muhannad is Professor of Sociology at Mount Royal University, born as a son of Silwan instead of a son of soil, yeah. A son of Silwan. Silwan is a very special neighborhood in Jerusalem, and with his family immigrated to Canada as a teenager. Muhannad has published his first monograph in 2019, The Hermeneutics of Violence, and has currently completed a second book manuscript. The chapter that was circulated for those that requested the paper is a chapter from Muhannad's second book, and that will be that will form the substance of today's seminar and discussion. And of course, Muhannad is also he's a board member of Al-Shabaka Policy Network, which is a very important organization, a Palestinian organization that puts out analysis, mainly policy analyses, but in the last couple of years have developed into a really substantive intellectual analyses, and I would encourage people who are interested in the debates the current debates on de-Zionization, decolonization, national liberation, and particularly how all these three programs, concepts, ideas, commitments might be thought. And these are particularly important questions for anyone outside of the region or for anyone who's not immediately implicated, but is interested, committed, and wishes to be in solidarity. As an academic, Muhannad has published widely in a range of journals, such as the European Journal of International Relations, a journal known to many of us here, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, as well as Critical Sociology, and is a regular contributor to Al-Jazeera, to the Baffler, Middle East Eye, Mondoweiss, The Breach, and Middle East Monitor. And for those who follow developments in Palestine, Israel, and the region, all of these are really important online platforms to follow. And just while Muhannad has been here, I I think I read an article that was published in Al-Jazeera on the same day or the same time as I was watching Al-Jazeera, and all of a sudden Muhannad popped up with his the Sea Point apartment in the background.
Greenpoint.
Greenpoint in the background to do an interview on Al-Jazeera. So very much a public intellectual, but today we have the great gift and privilege of engaging with Muhannad as a scholar and as an academic as well. So because Muhannad has this incredible facility as a public intellectual to move from the theoretical, the conceptual, the kind of more technical questions of a scholarly nature into a more general, open and generalist discourse, please feel free to make comments, not just ask questions. You know, please feel free after Muhannad has presented the chapter to engage as you would in any space. So, Muhannad, over to you.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for that far too kind of an introduction. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for coming here today and making time here today. For those joining online, I'm really humbled and appreciative of all Heidi's efforts here. Made me feel at home, like many of you have and many other people in this town have done since I've been here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed my time here. Obviously, when I started to think about coming here, the ongoing genocide had not started. The South African case to the International Court of Justice charging Israel with genocide had not begun, but all the more reason that I wanted to be here, to be frank, and away from a place like Canada during this time. Where, a slight correction, I am not featured on Canadian media.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Because they don't want what I say on air. And that's okay. I have my other platforms, TRT, Al Jazeera, TV stations in Pakistan, local radio stations here, alternative media in Canada, and even a couple of community radio stations in the US that I've spoken to. And I'm happy to continue to do that and challenge mainstream media and institutions in Canada in general. Whether it be universities, media institutions, political institutions that are determined to censor the Palestinian experience and to erase the Palestinian experience, and thereby participate in the erasure of Palestinians from history and politics. They are part and parcel of the Israeli settler colonial project, these institutions. And I have no problem calling them out on that and continuing to challenge them regardless of what they try to do to me. This paper, I'm just going to pull up my phone just to kind of keep an idea of time here so that I don't go over. I'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes or so, just kind of giving the overview of the paper that some of you may have had a chance to read, while others maybe just glanced over or hadn't had a chance to look at it all. So I'll try to speak to everyone wherever you are on that. Like Heidi said, I'd like this to be very much an open discussion. You don't have to ask me questions afterwards if there's something that I said registers with something you're working on. I'd like to hear about it. So we can just have it as a kind of a open seminar type of discussion over this material. I guess one of the reasons why I chose this particular chapter to focus on today is because of where I am and the focus on arts in this center and the humanities in this center as well. You know, I often have to start with the question in most settings in which I speak of, why even bring up literature at all when you're talking about settler colonial sovereignty and politics and the way that I discuss the Palestinian struggle. I guess I don't need that as much here. But I'll still say a couple of things about why focus on literature. And to me, the importance of literature is that it gives you an ability to see things differently from the dominant grammar and logics of colonial modernity. Literature has an ability to open up alternative avenues of seeing and conceptualizing and speaking about a decolonial alternative that theory, philosophy, social sciences don't necessarily have. It has an easier way of doing it, and does it with more depth, I find, than the social sciences or the humanities, for that matter. I think it plays a really critical role in that it as Fanon theorized many decades ago, that the role of the intellectual and the cultural producers, I hate that term, but you know what I mean, novelists, poets, in the national liberation struggle, is to do a couple of things. One, keep the people going, contextualize for them the nature of their struggle, and give them an idea of what that future liberation at least kind of might feel like or look like. So literature can do an amazing job in providing that kind of guidance for people on the path to liberation. In terms of Palestinian literature, it has always played that role. It has always played the role of galvanizing the people, giving them, like I said, direction, giving them purpose. Speaking to them on a level that they understand in a visceral way, in an emotional way, because all of these things are critical in the struggle for liberation. And of course, Palestinian literature is quite complex. It's quite vast. It's quite a large field. But the main reason I focus on two books in this chapter, Mahmoud Darwish's In the Absence of Presence, or Absent Presence, and Ilyas Khoury, who's not Palestinian, he's Lebanese, Gate of the Sun, is that those two texts I find really do speak to that decolonial alternative in ways that are quite deep, that are quite informative, that are quite illuminatory of what it is that is at stake here in Palestinian decolonial liberation. What does a full decolonial liberation, meaning the creation of an alternative world to colonial modernity, means and looks like? Now that's a gargantuan task, and of course we can't put it all on Darwish and Khoury, but they do, I think in those two texts especially, they do provide some key insights that we can then build on as scholars and as activists in this very difficult struggle. I think one of the more interesting things that is happening in these two texts in particular is a particular way of challenging our understanding of space and time and the relation between self and other. And those two are always connected for me. Whenever you start to reimagine space and time outside of the space and time of colonial modernity, more or less bounded space and linear time, progressive time, you start to really question, what does it mean to be a self? What does it mean to relate to others? And vice versa. Those two questions are always interconnected. And these two books really do quite an amazing job, I think, of challenging colonial, modernist, and postmodernist. Let's not forget that postmodernity is also colonial, versions of space and time. One of the key features of the writing that happens in those books is how they grapple with the question of erasure. The erasure of Palestine, and then the erasure of the author, which is the erasure of the quote-unquote I, our understanding of the I. And unlike, sort of postmodern critiques of modernist literature where they say the death of the author is associated with the centrality of the text, right? Like, so the author disappears because the text becomes more central. I don't find that interesting, sorry. I think much more interesting that happens in these texts, in their decolonial trajectory, not a postmodern trajectory, but in a decolonial trajectory, is that they show the erasure of the I as a necessary effect of writing the erasure of Palestine. So the erasure of the author, the erasure of the I as this sort of complete whole I in control of the writing, in control of the effects of the writing, etc., the erasure of that I happens as a direct result, as a necessary effect of writing erasure in a real, substantial way. Where you're not trying to accept the erasure of Palestine as a done deal, as a fact of nature that we're now going to just live with, nor are you trying to conceal the destructiveness of that erasure and its ongoing nature. So when you do that, which is much more difficult to do than to just say like I did in writing novels, when you do that, the effect is the erasure of the writing I, the erasure of the author. So what do I mean by that? So very briefly, if we look at Elias Khoury's Gate of the Sun, a brilliant novel that still inspires many Palestinian forms of activism today, as many other pieces of literature do. In a short summary, it's basically the book is a kind of a monologue. What looks like a dialogue, but it's really a monologue between two characters. Dr. Khalil, who's still alive, and is very much a character that is afflicted by the shattered state in which he finds himself in. And he's talking to Yunus, who's a freedom fighter who stubbornly resisted the fate of erasure and continuously fought. No matter how much losses he experienced and the Palestinian cause experienced, he just continued to fight no matter what. And now he's lying in a coma at this makeshift hospital. So Yunus is not talking in the story. It's just Dr. Khalil imagining their dialogue, recounting older dialogues they had with each other, and so on. So you have this sort of dialogue between this character who's afflicted by the shattered state of erasure and this character Yunus who's kind of oblivious to the shattered state of erasure. One of the critical elements that they talk about is how Yunus had built Bab al-Shams, which means Gate of the Sun, in this cave in Palestine. So he was already expelled to Lebanon, and as many Palestinians did, they kind of quote-unquote smuggled themselves back into their own homelands to revisit their destroyed villages, and many of them would use caves. So this was real, right? Like many of them would use caves as hiding places, and Yunus in this story is doing just that. He made this cave a liberated plot of Palestine, and he called it Bab al-Shams, the Gate of the Sun, meaning the sun lives inside the cave. So the cave is in this rendering, the sun lives in the cave because that's the only place where freedom and liberation can reside. And the truth and liberation can only reside inside the darkest of places. The sun can only exist in the darkest of places, not outside. Outside, the Israeli settler colonial project has now eliminated the ability for the sun to shine, because truth and liberation cannot live out in the open under settler colonial erasure, right? So it can only exist inside the cave. And actually harkens back to a lot of black feminist literature where there is also this kind of idea where the sun of liberation and truth only lies in the darkest places, not out in the open in society, where it is always destroyed the second it shines its light outside in the open. And one of the critical insights that Dr. Khalil comes to in his monologue with Yunus over this 9-month ordeal of him talking to Dr. Khalil, talking to Yunus, is that it was always a multiplicity of Yunus that lived inside the cave. That Yunus was not this one figure who could be easily cornered or discussed as this one being whose core is known and never changes. There's always a multiplicity of Yunuses that he's had these conversations with. And he realizes that in the cave, Yunus could be in his multiplicities. That symbolized the multiplicities of life and the different forms of life that existed in this only liberated plot of Palestine inside this cave. And that outside this cave, if this sun of multiplicity, of Eunice, was ever to come outside this cave, in the context of colonial modernity, in the context of Israeli settler colonialism, it would be erased. Because the Israeli settler colonial project does not operate on multiplicity. In fact, it operates on the forceful molding of multiplicity into these notions of pure, discrete, distinct races and identities. And the erasure and the expulsion of the Palestinian identity in order to secure the pure Jewish sovereign lord of the land. And I'll talk more about that later. And in fact, he comes to that realization even more when he talks about how on Eunice's death, it was a multiplicity of Eunices that went to shut down the cave, the gate of the sun. That it was Eunice's sons and their sons, all named Eunice. So it's multiplicity coming to the rescue of multiplicity to shut down the cave, because that was the only way to keep that struggle for decolonial liberation going. It was only in the multiplication of the self, of life, of different life forms, that you have the antidote to Israeli settler colonialism, where it is based on this notion of an indivisible, pure, unalloyed sovereign self. So if the Son of Truth and Liberation leaves this space of multiplicity, it will be overpowered by the mono-history in what I would call the dictatorial sovereign eye of settler colonial sovereignty. And that is what underpins settler colonial sovereignty. It's a dictatorial sovereign eye. It's an eye that summons the dictatorial potency of this indivisible, pure, unalloyed, even pre-political substance. It doesn't exist. This is a complete fantasy and mythology. But that is precisely what settler colonial sovereignty rests upon, is that mythology. That aspiration for the creation of this pure, unalloyed, pre-political sovereign self. But just because it's not real doesn't mean that when it seeks to create that part is not real. That part is all too real. And it leads in what we're seeing today, the genocide of the Palestinian people. That is precisely what underpins Israeli settler colonial sovereignty and other settler colonial projects as well, is this chase for this pure, unalloyed, like I said, almost pre-political, pure substance of the self that they call the quote-unquote sovereign Jewish self. A complete mythology from beginning to end, but one that has devastating consequences for the Palestinian people. And what you also see in that is how colonial modernity tries to mold and shape the multiplicity of space itself. The malleability of space into this colonial version of place. Because that sovereign, unalloyed, pure sovereign eye, it becomes fused with the idea of land as this bounded space, bounded place that belongs to that pure sovereign eye. There's a fusion of land and people that happens there that tries to assert the purity of the land to only belong to this, exclusively belong to this pure identity of the self. So the whole novel reveals that the ways in which colonial modernity works to shape the malleability of space into these bounded entities we call the nation states under this kind of form of exclusive colonial sovereignty. But it doesn't just do that with space, it does that with time as well. And this is where I bring in Darwish, whose work, I think, reveals that linear progressive version of time of colonial modernity better than does Khoury's text. Although both texts address both elements, just one exists, I find, accentuated more in the other. So in the absence of presence, Darwish's basically autobiography. But it's not an autobiography like your regular autobiography. It's you might be confused when you first read it as to what it is. because it reads like a dialogue when it first starts, and you're like, who's he talking to? And then you discover as you read the book more that it's him writing this book at the end of his life, having a dialogue with himself at each stage of his life, starting when he was in the womb, right? So it's a dialogue between him and himself at each stage of life. And what I think part of the brilliance of the book is that it shows you, in that very technique of writing an autobiography, the impossibility for the Palestinian who has experienced erasure and destruction and elimination and expulsion to speak about the I as a harmonious whole. That the possibility does not exist, especially for those expelled from their land like Darwish was. There's a moment of rupture that can't be undone. You can't just smooth it over and say, I'm whole and complete now. No, there's a rupture that erases the ability for you to become whole and complete. And what is brilliant about Darwish is that he doesn't try to force a harmonious or complete rereading of his life. He just says, every time the capacity to write starts from a position that inevitably scatters me. Right? Like he was about 8 years old when he was expelled, right? When I go back to the beginning, I know where the beginning is going to end in scattering at a very early stage. So he doesn't try to then force some kind of wholeness onto that rupture by recreating a different kind of linear story, a linear story that would be centered on rupture, aka postmodernist literature. It is now just letting go of the notion of linearity altogether. It is just saying the I dissipates in this inability to distinguish between past, present, and future. So I'm not going to try to remake sense of past, present, and future in a different way. I'm just going to accept my condition as not being able to make sense of past, present, and futures like others do. There's laments in his writing. You can feel like laments about like, what might it be like to be able to write about myself as a past, present, future like everybody else seems to be able to? So there's maybe laments about that, but there's no effort to try to force that onto the writing. He accepts that condition, but not in a way that then acquiesces to settler colonial expulsion and elimination. That's the critical part. It resists that. And it tries to do the writing in such a way where it shows the shallowness of all writing that works in a past, present, future neat way. That all writing that tries to create harmony and wholeness in the self and instead opens up to the multiplicity of the self, the dissipation of the self. But he does something more than that. So here time kills us, it dissipates the self. And there's lines like this in Khoury's novel as well. It's like, when you think about time, what is it doing? It's killing us. Like right now, it's killing me. I'm getting closer to the end of my life. But it's not just like a nihilistic way of understanding that. It's more about how time kills us in the sense of dissipating the self, right? And showing its multiplicities and how the self is always co-constituted with others. You're never just like in charge of yourself as like a being that exists all on your own. This is the mythology of settler colonialism and colonial modernity. But this is where he becomes especially special. He always includes the Israeli other in his writing. He does not shy away from how the Israeli other is also a co-constituent of himself. Now, in Darwish, there isn't a mono-Israeli other. There's different kinds of Israeli others that appear in his writing. The love affair, Irida, different kinds, right? But the most important one is the Israeli other that is intent on eliminating the Palestinian. The Israeli other that is seeking to continuously expel, eliminate, and erase the Palestinian. That also appears in his writing. That's, again, much more difficult to accomplish than just said, right? Especially when you get into literature. But it is always there. And that other is, he's trying to grapple in his writing with that other that is co-constituent of the self, but is a co-constituent that is trying to eliminate the self. Expel the self, erase the self, the Palestinian self. So this is what I think. This is why I think the elimination of the erasure of the author is a necessary effect of writing erasure. Because it's not easy to look into a mirror that shows part of the co-constituents is the part that wants me dead, that wants me gone, that doesn't recognize my humanity, etc., etc. So there's always that destructiveness, the brutality of that Israeli other inside the self. So how you deal with that then becomes very critical. And I think that what his work does, what the brilliance of Darwish does, is to show a way of showing how that must necessarily lead to a kind of self-annihilation. But it's not, again, not a nihilistic self-annihilation, not one that acquiesces to settler colonial power, but a self-annihilation that is leading towards the creation of something new. So when he writes about it, he shows how the co-constituency of the self, that includes the destructive, brutal other that wants to destroy and create this pure, unalloyed, discrete, pure race, blah, 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 within the self, how that looks like, how that exists, what does it mean, and then the imagination of something that would counter that would reimagine the co-constituency of the self in a direction that doesn't follow that way of co-constituting the self. So this is not about reconciliation with the brutality of the other that wants to eliminate you. You can't. You can't reconcile with another that says, I am your master and Lord. I am your master and Lord ends the conversation. That's it. No reconciliation is possible there. But you can challenge that, oppose that, dismantle that, and create a different kind of co-constituency. And that's why it is necessary to let go of colonial modernist and postmodernist imaginaries and practices of space-time and self-other. Because they are built in such a way where they can only lead to a continuation of that process. There's no decolonial liberation if, Palestinians become the masters and lords. That's not decolonial liberation. You can call that some kind of liberation, but it's not the Palestinian liberation, but it's not decolonial liberation, because it did not, in fact, transform the logics and grammars of colonial modernity. And the Palestinian decolonial struggle is nothing short of that. It has to be, if it is going to be fully decolonial, it has to be a radical transformation of colonial modernity. And I think what works of literature like Darwish and Khoury do is allow us to enter a space where, like an imaginary space, where we start to ask ourselves questions that have become more or less stale in colonial modernity. Nobody's really asking in any serious way questions about humanity, the meaning of the social, the meaning of the political, sovereignty, the state. If you stay within the paradigm of colonial modernity, those questions are already answered. There's just debates about tinkering with this and that. It's only, the dreams of a C.L.R. James, the Frantz Fanons, the Edward Saids, the M.A. Césaires, that there would be a radical questioning of all those things in the creation of an alternative world. And so this is what is required. So what Darwish and Khoury and others, of course, they're not the only two, but those are the two that I focused on, what they enable you to do is to take you back to fundamental questions that colonial modernity has said, stop looking at those. We've answered those. We've reached the apex of humanity on all those questions. You just got to follow it in this stupid development model or that development model or whatever other nonsense. But that's not the task. If we are serious about the Palestinian decolonial liberation as a decolonial liberation against colonial modernity, then it has to be a fundamental transformation of all of those questions, of all of those institutions, and therefore asking some deeper questions about how we organize social and political life. So that's why I oppose in the book, the question of settler colonial sovereignty versus decolonial sovereignties. And the reason I pluralize decolonial sovereignties is because it can rest on this model of the multiplication of the self, this multiplication of the I, the notion of the dissipation of the self in time, the unboundedness of space, the malleability of place. That once you get into that imaginary theoretical space, then you can start to ask really fundamental questions about how to transform sovereignty. And this is not just purely a theoretical exercise. Decolonial sovereignties already exist in Palestinian resistance. They exist in other areas as well of the world, historically and in the present. It's just a matter of finding the right conceptual frameworks of talking about those, so as to, we do now, as well in the humanities and the social sciences, what Fanon said the cultural realm should do, is direct the people towards a different way of thinking about their liberation struggle. They're already doing it. In the popular committees of the First Intifada, they were already practicing decolonial sovereignties. It's just a matter of properly conceptualizing. That's all I'm doing in this book. Just properly conceptualizing actions that already exist in order to guide, who am I to guide? In order to just paint the paths. Okay, this path could theoretically lead to a decolonial alternative, a real alternative to not just Israeli settler colonialism, but colonial modernity more broadly. That's the job of theory as I see it. In a nutshell, I'm trying to revisit certain conceptions of space and time and self and others and self-other relations in order to remake the unbearability that we see in front of us in Palestine today, the unbearability of the conditions under which Palestinians are forced to live today. The genocidal operation in the Gaza Strip is not the first genocide committed against the Palestinian people, nor will it be the last, if nothing changes. It's also not the first genocide that we've seen in this era of colonial modernity. None of this is new. If you've been reading decolonial scholarship, you understand that Zionism is a political project that is born of and for colonial modernity. That is what it is, root and stem. Even prior to the enactment of that ideology in the settler colonial project, it was already racist and settler colonial. Because it accepted all the foundations of colonial modernity. The second that Zionism made the conclusion that there has to be a Jewish state in the mold of the European state, in the land of the East, in order for Jews to become like the rest of the civilized Europeans, it joined the project of colonial modernity. Simple. And it borrowed all it borrowed all the tactics and operations of colonial violence, but that was already inscribed in its foundation. That it operated on this notion of distinct, discrete, pure races whose sovereignty and civilization whose civilization depends on the creation of this exclusive notion of sovereignty, this Euro-American mode of sovereignty that did not exist in the large history of human history. Even in the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, none of them practiced this kind of exclusive sovereignty. They were shared. They had a much more layered and shared mode of sovereignty, with its own brutalities, but nothing compared to this. I say it with complete confidence that this Euro-American colonial project is the most destructive thing ever visited on humanity. So Zionism was always part of that project and continues it. And so what we see here today is simply the intensification of already ongoing structural violences. Particularly Israeli settler colonial structures of genocidal violence and Euro-American imperial structures of violence. Because that's what Israel is for the American Empire. It's an imperial outpost that enables those imperial structures of violence to keep building. And so the Palestinian struggle for liberation has always been about that, has always been about challenging these systems of colonial modernity. And that is precisely, by the way, what also scares so many post-colonial regimes around the world. That scares the American empire. That scares the European hegemonic imperial alliance. Is that it does present an alternative to their world. This is why countries that also want to take a jab at that imperial world order, not necessarily to transform it, but to give themselves a better standing in it, that's why they draw on the Palestinian struggle. Because they do see it as a struggle that pokes holes in the story of the Euro-American empire. They do see it as something that shows clearly that all this talk about international law is a bunch of BS. That all this notion about human rights is a bunch of BS. It shows the hypocrisy of the West like nothing else can. So, but what we need to be doing as decolonial scholars and activists is to push for the Palestinian cause to become this kind of spark plug and guide for, I would say, dying decolonial struggle. The post-colonial state has dealt us a real blow. Let's be upfront. The decolonization struggles of the 20th century aimed for something much bigger than what we ended up with across the world. But these post-colonial states have become very useful in suppressing that desire for true decolonial liberation. But that desire is not dead. That's why people fill the streets. That's why people fill the streets in Yemen. That's why people fill the streets in Malaysia. In the UK, there's people there that also want to get rid of this colonial modernity. In the US, even in Canada. It's because it ignites something in people. It reminds them of what it is that they are really striving towards. And I do think that this potentiality for decolonial liberation is being kept alive by the Palestinian struggle. And I go back to the popular committees very quickly of the first Intifada. This was not the first time that popular committees had appeared in Palestine. They appeared in exactly the same way, more or less exactly the same. Of course, there's comparative analysis to be done, but you know what I mean. In their foundation, very similar to the Palestinian popular committees of the 1930s, when they revolted against British imperialism and Zionist settler colonialism. They were very similar in how they operated. They created an alternative system of social and political life. It was rule by the people, for the people, in an actual meaningful way, not the American fake way, where elites, white male, propertied white males wrote the Constitution in what? How long did they take to write the Constitution? Not long. And wrote it for other white propertied men. This was real governance on the ground, where popular committees appeared everywhere in Palestine to guide the affairs, everyday affairs of people's everyday needs, from food to education to healthcare to organizing for mass action, withdrawal of participation from Israeli settler colonial structures, and so on and so forth. And they reimagined sovereignty in that sense. No leadership emerged that said, we're now the central authority, these are our diktats, and everybody has to follow. If you look at the communiques of the national leadership that emerged, it was like, listen to your popular committees. You are the popular committees. So listen to yourselves, is what they were saying. I mean, how many times have you heard that from your governments? That was one of the reasons why the Israeli government was terrified of those popular committees, why they criminalized them. Yitzhak Rabin, the man of peace, criminalized those committees because they created, like I said, an alternative structure of governance. And what the Israeli state decided to do with the quote-unquote peace process was to defeat them through the Palestinian Authority and create a semi-post-colonial type of regime that will do the dirty work for the imperial power, and in this case the settler colonial power, in order to continue these structures from being really challenged. So that is, the general picture of how I see decolonial liberation, the role that literature can play, the role that theory can play in understanding the current situation and the path forward for decolonial liberation. And it can come in various forms, and I do acknowledge that there's such a thing as a partial decolonial liberation versus a full decolonial liberation and so on, which I talked about last week at another talk. Happy to do that here if people want, but there's no absolutes in this. But that is what I try to do, is lay out the different paths, and let's just be upfront about where we are and where we're going, and what might each set of actions guide us to. So I'll end it there. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I think we can easily keep you here for a few more hours and a few more talks, but definitely for today, I think we're going to have a robust conversation. I have my own comments and questions. The paper was really beautiful and inspiring for so many reasons, but I have a deep interest in partition in Palestine-Israel, and the reason, and I say both because, in a sense, that co-constitution is one of the big ethical, political, and, as you put it, first and foremost, aesthetic problematics to deal with, and so that kind of opening is incredibly. I think the generosity in this move, it reminds me of the kind of hospitality that was palpable during the political transition and in the kind of move towards the political transition and negotiations in South Africa. And I'm saying that because of the feeling, not because of the analogy. And so I just want to be careful to not kind of push an analogy that, in my own reading, has come to the end of its life. And so what we're, and I would ask now with comments and questions to hold the kind of particularities of the Palestine-Israel kind of question, let's say, in mind when responding to Muhannad's paper and the talk that he gave.
Been deeply committed to thinking what about this problem we share in the question of apartheid and its aftermaths and aftermaths. But two terms you used set my mind racing. The one was indivisible and the other was substance. And of course those hark back to 18th century birth of rational philosophy. And we know that in some sense that degraded script is what gave us, firstly, not only slavery, but colonialism. And in its aftermath, a kind of decimation of the partitioned world that we inhabit in different forms after the Second World War. So I was thinking about, where the endpoints of that narrative, where they land. And in some respects, they land in the condition of the nation state, which you interestingly mark as the problem of post-coloniality. I always thought that that would be a different way to think of, that post-coloniality would be a critique of nationalism for one, but also the nation state as a condition. So I'm thinking about what we name this other space we want to be in. And I'm wondering whether, and I'm thinking here particularly about a critique in 1976 around the question when black consciousness became a phenomenon in South Africa. The Review of African Political Economy invited Martin Legassic and Harold Walpe, who were ideologues of different factions of the left movement and the Marxist tradition in South Africa, to write a paper on the question of decoloniality and capital. And they have a debate with Keano and argue that apartheid was in fact not a decolonial problem. That in fact, if you thought about the movements in capital, that something else was afoot. And so I want to ask again here, the names we give things are often also the ways we chart paths out of the predicaments that we find ourselves in. What we do with this hyper-technologized capital, and the way in which today the reports on AI as a kind of function of this genocide and its execution. I mean, you're dealing with a technology that is being tested in the midst of a genocide that is unfolding. How we score and square that set of questions. So I'm asking, you know, I hear your point about, you know, that there's an intensification but a repetition without difference. So that I agree with. But I'm wondering about intensification, because that would also bring together a different configuration of time and space in the way that Paul Virilio imagines it through the book on the information bomb, but also this masochism of speed that is producing untenable conditions of life for which the nation state is just inadequately prepared to even grapple with. I don't know if that might, you know, gets you into a, it's more conversation and a curiosity about what we name this problem, and whether the rush to ground to name it decoloniality might be premature before we anticipate all the configurations of power that are at play.
Thank you for the paper and for sharing with us and this gift to be able to talk through it with you, and for bringing the answer on the table and in the discourse, because we're just bombarded by so much coverage that speaks in different languages, that doesn't invite metaphor, that doesn't invite imagination, that doesn't invite, I would say, the feminized spaces, and not feminine as in a quality of gender, but feminine as an alterity, as an alternative. I'll talk about that, but I'm speaking about the AI. So just after reading your paper, and yeah, I'm just going to speak, you know, I'm reading in Al-Jazeera about, you know, they've just discovered that AI is being used the AI programs are directing the bombing. They're using it to profile. In fact, sadistically named the lavender. I mean, you know, to term an AI program that is designed to profile Hamas informants, and then is used to direct the dumb bombing. And you spoke in the paper about the singular and the specific and the specified. And it's so interesting that the means of eradication are working against the individual. That this AI, the program that is being designed, is actually designed to target spaces and home spaces and the space of the house. So an individual is believed or is known by the AI to stay in that dwelling place. So the whole dwelling place is being targeted irrespective of the casualties. So that entire home and household place is being eradicated by the machine. That is being designed within the within a very specific perspective. So, you know, this concept of place and the individual, place and the specified, actually that specificity is, there is no specificity in, I mean, it's a different type of specificity where the individual does not exist, where the individual is already deemed erased. And then I was just thinking the metaphor of the cave, the parable of the cave, and I'm thinking of the place of parables, the place of storytelling in a war that is targeting children so much, that is eliminating the child, the minor, and what it means to nurture spaces of imagination, not just imagination, but space for generation, for generative. And so I was thinking of the subterranean, not as a subterranean that hides, you know, subterranean right now is the place where the enemy hides out and is building networks, but actually subterranean as a space, as an alternative space to this light that is literally the light of annihilation.
So to kind of actually clarify in terms of my own argument, I actually argue that the nation state is not as significant as the question of sovereignty. Yeah. So it's you know. Okay. So yeah. Let me start it that way, and then reach into how I think about the nation state towards the end of the book, which is so in the beginning, what I say is that the question of sovereignty is the more critical one, because it's something that operates not just underneath, and not even before, after. It's not even thinkable. It's just underneath, through, and beyond the nation state, and the notion of an indivisible, pure, omnipresent settler colonial sovereignty is, of course, never real, never exists in real practice. But since that is the aspiration of the settler sovereign, it gives rise to all sorts of projects that are just audacious when you really think about it. The notion that you have the right to eliminate an entire society and replace it, the idea that you have the right to enslave millions of people, the idea that you have the right to say, the rest of humanity should follow what I think man is. These are attributes that the majority of human societies have left in the realm of the gods or God. Never even dared touch them as a thing that humans can do. But this is what the Euro-American project does. And nothing to do with them being white or European or none of that nonsense. But this is what we ended up with in the contingencies and experiments, or sorry, the contingencies and the shitty luck in this case of history. Is that we ended up with this empire emerging at this particular historical period in this particular location that had the audacity to think that it was God. Make man in its own image. It literally is doing that, right? Like, these are things that we only associate with the realm of the gods. In previous empires, never even dared to think of doing these things. The Mongols were like, oh, you keep ruling yourselves. Just pay us tribute. And if you don't, we'll kill you. So it's brutal, don't get me wrong. But they never thought, like, we're going to remake the political for you. Never did that. Romans didn't do that. The British did. French did. The Dutch did. They were like, yeah, we're going to remake them into our own image. So that when they resist us like people like us. So they're always behind us. So we maintain our rule over them. This is such a despicable idea. But it is driven by that aspiration towards indivisibility and so on. So that's why I focus on that. Now, within that realm, you have the construction of this thing called the nation state. And I tend to agree with like historians like Burbank. These are not decolonial historians, right? Like they were empire states for the longest time. Nation states are like at most a couple of 100 years old. You know, the overwhelming majority of nation states are less than that. Israel is 75. That's it, right? It's 75 years old. So now the question of decoloniality and the nation state then becomes a much larger question with tons of debate around it. I mean, I tend to always just go back to the ideas of Fanon and Said and others that had this ambivalence toward the nation state. They just saw it as a tool that achieves this grander goal. It has not ended up being that. It had become the final goal. and particularly the post-colonial regimes. And that's why I try to use the term regimes more than the nation state. Post-colonial regimes became part of the infrastructure of empire. And you know, it's not just me saying that. People on the streets are always saying that. Right? Like, you go talk to Egyptians today, they can't wait to get rid of that regime. They want to desperately. They're just not it's not easy. It's not easy to do. So and then you add the question of capitalism in it, and capital and AI and all of these things that make the task ahead even that much more gargantuan in terms of resistance. Now, I do tend to, in terms of the larger question of capitalism and settler colonialism, I do tend to agree with Gurminder Bambra, Glenn Coulthard. I'm more on their side of it, where, of course, you know, I'm writing a paper right now on racial capitalism in Palestine, so it's something to be taken very seriously and analyzed. Like, I agree with all those analyses, but to me, it's not the backbone. The backbone always remains in settler colonialism dispossession, not proletarianization. That's what Coulthard says, basically, and I think he's right. And Bambra takes it to the level of in her very excellent 2020 article on challenging the Nancy Fraser way of framing capitalism, and she goes, well, None of it is possible without. None of these transformations within capitalism are possible without colonialism and the slave trade and slavery and settler colonialism. And each stage can, in fact, even the welfare state, right? Like as theorists of capitalism from a purely political economic perspective will look at, like the welfare state arises as of labor movements. Well, yeah, but if there wasn't all the wealth they generated from robbing the world blind, there wouldn't have been money to share in the welfare state to begin with. You know, it's always part of that story of capital and capitalism. That to me has to be understood within that context of colonial modernity always. And you know, there are others, of course, better placed than me to talk about AI and these kinds of technologies and techniques. But how I sort of always think about all of those new techniques that we're seeing today. So, for example, the focus on space is not new in the Israeli, I call them genocide forces. Eyal Weizman was talking about similar things that you just described from 2007, right? Like of how they attack space as opposed to people. In their training, how they read Deleuze and Guattari to do that, right? Like his famous article on that. And other postmodern theory that the IDF was using to train their soldiers and how to attack spaces as opposed to people and how, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But of course it's intensified and yeah, I mean, I'm like you, I listen to people who know AI better than I do, and they talk about that in terms of the technicalities and all of it. But to me, theoretically, it always goes back to the logic of elimination and expulsion. That's what underpins it all to this day. Because the whole thing about attacking space in this case, in the genocide, is to make the land uninhabitable. They don't need to kill everyone. But if there are no hospitals, no schools, no universities, no economy, no agricultural field, no fishing, no communications, no infrastructure, how are you going to live there? That's their goal. Their goal is to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible from the Gaza Strip. Has been from day one. And they're doing it step by step. Whether it works or not remains to be seen. Palestinians are resilient. They might still find a way to live on that land. But the Israelis are working very hard to make it impossible for people to inhabit that land. And the Israelis have always viewed that they have time. Time is on their side, not on the Palestinian side. So if it takes them 3 years to do this, I don't know, we got time. It doesn't have to be that everybody leaves today. If you make the land uninhabitable, eventually they'll leave. And people will forget, they'll move on. They're counting on this, by the way. The Israelis and the Americans are counting on this. A couple of years from now, you all will have just moved on. Maybe not you, but the general public, they think, we'll just move on. We'll move on to the next thing, and people will forget. And when it empties drip by drip, you don't have the 24 hours coverage that you're getting right now from only like Al-Jazeera and other stations, not in mainstream media. But yeah, that's their thinking. So attacking space is precisely still part of this eliminatory project of Palestinian life on the land. And they do, they believe that one day they'll just, once it's empty of the Palestinians, they'll come and take it. Just like they've done in every other piece that became Israel. How did you think it came into being? Exactly like this. Different technologies, different techniques, but exactly like this in terms of the logics. And I do quite love the subterranean sort of idea. You know, the one thought that came to mind is you mentioned children as well, is how that survives inside someone's imagination as well. That every Palestinian probably carries that somewhere. Their truth, the light of truth and liberation remains within the body of every Palestinian. Even if we can't recreate it in a cave like they do in the story, that cave is inside us. And that's something Israel can't get to. Which is why the resistance will never die. Which is why Israel will never actually succeed. In the long, long term, they will never succeed in this project. It's impossible. We've not given up over 100 years. We're not giving up forever. So even if they do succeed, even in this, in the eradication of Gaza, it's not over. So that whole aspiration for the creation of exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty, colonial sovereignty over the entire land, even if they actually find a place where they're like, we finally achieved it, we've created greater Israel, it's over, it's not over. There will be war. Guarantee you. There will be a war that upends that. Nothing taken by force remains held by force forever. That is the rule of history. And to avoid that path, I only know of one other one. And that is economic and political isolation of the Israeli state. That's the only path towards de-Zionization and moving towards something like what I'm talking about. But yeah.
My first question / comment, but I really would be grateful for your view, is that what you've put on the table, at least with this chapter, which I found very moving, because it takes on the task, and this is a point of huge debate and contestation, it takes on the task from the perspective of what could be called, or what you point to as Palestinianization, to also offer an analysis for de-Zionization. Now, I know inside 1948, inside Israel, the big debate has been, and not only inside, outside, has been, that there's been, firstly, a naturalization of a partitionist paradigm, sensibility, but also a kind of justifiable moral refusal to also, as the oppressed, take on the work of de-Zionization. Besides it being impossible at some level, it's also been seen as a kind of unjust labor, that why should the labor of liberation fall both on the oppressed, but also the liberation of the oppressor fall on the shoulders of the oppressed. And what you're actually presenting is very much the kind of gesture, gift, vision, hospitality that South Africans received, particularly those raised white. In other words, particularly those implicated in the regime of apartheid simply by virtue of an accident of birth, right? So it's not essentializing, but it's saying as a class, as a collective, and apartheid in South Africa resided in the unmaking of black people as individuals, right? So it was to create blackness as an agglomeration, always as a collective, always as mob, gang. I mean, it fed into a whole discursivity that was politically instrumentalized. But that work of both providing a vision of freedom that those who were the oppressors, or who have and who are historically implicated in being, in the oppressor class, in the perpetrator, or let's say colonizer class, that work to offer a vision, which is intellectual work, but it's much more. Your paper points to the absolute crucial area of the kind of psychic effects of annihilation, of extermination, of displacement, of settler colonialism, of apartheid, of partition and occupation. And I know those all I'm putting into a bag one set, a whole lot of concepts that do different work in the context that you laid out for us. But it does seem from your paper and from your talk that you're proposing, this is the task of liberation, the intellectual task for liberation, is to say, you too can de-Zionize, and this is how. That without annihilating your ego, you will experience the dissolution which is existential. Now, to tell that to Jews as a collective is pretty powerful, given the terrible kind of convergence of historical unfoldings that make the Jewish occupier, colonizer, overlord also the third generation survivor from the concentration camps, right? Which makes the particular predicament of Palestine incredibly complex in a way that I don't think we have a view of exactly. So with that very long-winded preamble, to both ask you to perhaps comment on that task that you have appeared to set for Palestinian national liberation struggle, and how in that task you're also saying, without explicitly saying, and perhaps it's a saying that needs to stay in the cave for now, that there is a way to live beyond an identity that creates you as the overlord.
Yes.
So, yeah, if you could respond to that, I think it would be amazing to hear you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And as I say in the chapter, you know, it is an unfair ask, but the world is not fair. What do you want me to do? Look, there is Zionism, like I said, is irredeemable. It's settler, colonial, and racist root and stem. But Jewish life on the land is not irredeemable, and it can exist on the land, but it can't be Zionist. It's not complicated, and therefore the land can be shared in that way, and where we open up to the multiplicity of the self in a real substantial way. So now, in terms of the so in terms of, let me just kind of jump to this part first and then address some of your comments. In terms of how de-Zionization can come about, it can only come about through pressure. There's no path towards de-Zionization from within the Israeli community. There's no path of de-Zionization that the Palestinians can enforce on the Israeli community. Neither path exists. It is only if Israel is completely isolated politically, economically, and pressured legally, that then Israelis will have to start to consider these questions, and will have to then be forced into de-Zionization. There's no other way. You're going to be forced into de-Zionization either through war or this way. There's no other way. You're not going to do this forever. Nobody stays Lord forever. Never happened. Why do you think it would happen this time? It won't. So this is actually, it's in their self-interest to transform into a different path. And that different path can only be traveled with Palestinians. So if you're going to do that, then you have to then de-Zionize by necessity. So, and vice versa. Palestinians cannot bring about a decolonial liberation without Israelis. Unless you do engage in a war of annihilation, there's no other way. You're living with them. And if you do a war of annihilation, I mean, first of all, that's many years away. Like I said, it will happen, but that won't be good for anybody. What's that going to do? It's going to create another nation state that looks like the Euro-American one with lordship and all the rest of it. It's not going to be real liberation, decolonial liberation. So the only real path for Palestinians to actually travel down a path of decolonial liberation is to eventually figure out a different way of living with Israelis. So it might look like a very, like you said, generous thing and all of it, but it's also a real politique thing too. There's and different people will come at it from different perspectives. I'm not naive, right? Like some people do need the self-interest to act. Not everybody will just go on the basis of aspirations for decolonization and the rest of it. Some people need self-interest and realpolitik in the discussion. And that would be it for them. it's in your self-interest to avoid a genocide and war. I don't see a better self-interest than that. And the prospect of actually building something that is worthy of aspiration the world over, I mean, that alone should inspire people to act in that direction. So, you know, if we take seriously what I talked about in terms of what Darwish taught and what Khoury teaches and what many others teach of the multiplicity of the self, of the co-constituency of the self, then that becomes the ground from which you work. And then you work from there without thinking about, am I being generous or am I being, you just do, you follow what is right. You follow truth, you follow justice, you follow those two things. and you go where that takes you. You know, I understand why some see it as an unfair ask. I understand why some see it as asking too much of the oppressed. But I ultimately think that in order for it to get to where we want to go, everybody will have to actually participate equally. So it's not like I can liberate Jews or Israelis. I can't. They have to actually do the work themselves. They have to de-Zionize first and then get on the task of building this alternative world with me. So it's not going to be about me carrying all the load or Palestinians carrying all the load. Moreover, it is very critical to not do what was done here, which is to say we're not going to really address the historical and current injustices. That's, like, to me, for example, land redistribution is part of the foundation of the alternative. The Palestinian right of return is part of the foundation of the alternative. These are not things that we arrive at after we start to build the alternative. No, these are the starting points. Because if you wait until afterwards, you find yourself in some of the situations that you find yourself in here. Land redistribution happening through gentrification, as you showed me last week. It's not even land redistribution, it's the continuation of expulsion from the land through gentrification. So you end up with these even more complex things that you can't pinpoint and address the same way that you can at certain moments in history. It becomes much more difficult to address them later than in the moment of change, in the moment of transformation. So to me, it's critical that things like land redistribution and the Palestinian right of return, and I am a proponent of communal ownership as well, to address some of the problems with capitalism. As I said in my talk on Saturday, one of the advantages that the case of Palestine and Israel enjoys over others in terms of land redistribution is because Israel is a racist project, they don't have large private ownership. Approximately 93% of the land outside of the West Bank and Gaza Strip is owned by the state or by quasi-state agencies. The reason being simple: if it is purely free market capitalism, a rich Palestinian can come and buy all the land. So because they want it to be Jewish land, because it's a racist project, the state owns it. Nice, makes land redistribution a lot easier. So you can advocate for communal ownership and land redistribution in ways that are not possible in other contexts there. But that, to me, has to be part of the foundational part of the alternative and the Palestinian right of return. There's no ways around that. So I make it very clear that the guiding post for the decolonial alternative path is the Palestinian path. Not because it's Palestinian by culture or nationality or identity or anything like that. It's because that is the path that occupies the position of the colonized. That is therefore the path that can lead to decolonization. Israelis can join that path because it's not defined by identity or nationality. It's defined by political positionality.
Right.
Therefore, anybody can join any political positionality if they wish, as some Israelis do. very few, and those who do leave because they can't live there anymore, but you can join it. Yeah. Yeah. Does that answer?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to continue this conversation.
Yeah.
I think it's an incredibly courageous position to open up and to put forward, particularly at this moment. And I think there's something so important in doing it, because what it does is it resists succumbing to the possibility of producing a mirror opposite, which is deeply understandable given what's happening. The intense, I mean, it's so overwhelming, the intensity of this annihilation and displacement, that it's very difficult to not have this visceral response as extreme, and to hold this other possibility open now is also holding open a possibility for thinking and for thought. And what we're witnessing, I think, takes it away. It attenuates thinking. One's so overwhelmed by the effect on the body and the mind, and just on all, all parts of one's being. I cannot imagine what it is to be Palestinian in this moment. And so to kind of offer a space of thought is a gift that also, for us. Thank you.